Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's presentation of Poems for the Pandemic. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the curator of programming at Planet Word. We are a museum of words and language in downtown DC. So if you're able to come to Washington, we are open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. Admission is free. You can reserve your pass on our website, planetwordmuseum.org. If you're not in DC or you're not yet comfortable going to museums, welcome to this virtual way to participate with Planet Word. If you found out about this program because you're a member and you're getting our newsletter, thank you so much for that support. It's how we're able to keep admission free for folks. If you found out about this program through another channel, through Poetry in America or something else, and you'd like to know more about Planet Word and the virtual programs we offer, my colleague Kel Millionet is in the chat, and he is posting links to our website so that you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us that way. So I am delighted to welcome our guest, Lisa New. She is a professor of American literature at Harvard. She's the host and director of Poetry in America, the series on PBS, and the director of Verse Video Education. And she's on the Planet Word Advisory Board for our purposes. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you for being such a supporter of Planet Word from the very beginning.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm so excited that the museum has opened and that you have human visitors.
Right. Live in-person human video for visitors. It is wonderful. That for those of you who haven't been, that is it in my Zoom background, by the way. We're in this very cool historic schoolhouse in downtown DC at the corner of 13th and K Northwest. So Lisa, let's start with this article you co-wrote for the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, about this idea of poetry as healing. Where did the impetus for that, in a peer-reviewed medical journal come from, and what role do you think poetry plays in medicine?
Well, I think we've learned during this pandemic what, to use that term, humans have known for a long time, that medicine may cure our symptom, may alleviate our symptoms, may even cure our diseases, but our hearts, in the more figurative sense, slowly break over the course of our lives. And as they break, they soften. And we need to process our losses. As human beings, the one unique faculty we have for processing is language, is words, which is what you've devoted a whole museum to. And I think it can't be said enough that refined language that we've kept as a civilization through time is language that's what a poem is language that speaks to our deepest needs. And to go to the topic you raised first, publishing an article on poems for the pandemic in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think medicine, from what I hear, is waking up to the humanistic imperatives that go to our well-being, as well as the alleviation of our pains and the splinting of our sprains and the elimination of our cancer cells. And so JAMA invited this article, and what I and my co-author, Dr. Rafael Campo, who's also a poet, what we tried to do is find a few poems that would address often unspoken sufferings, that we're all feeling. We chose one poem that's about watching the end of life. We chose one poem that's about experiencing the end of life, where a poet imagines what it's like, and imagines in a very beautiful way. And there's comfort in that. And we offered one poem that offers an analysis of human loss and what human beings do with their some of the useful things they do and some of the messed up things they do in their minds to get themselves through experiences of loss. And JAMA has been overwhelmed by the number of hits and
Oh, really?
Oh
Isn't
yeah,
that interesting?
it's
Yeah.
really off the charts, the interest in poetry. And poetry is having a moment for various reasons, in part because it's always spoken to our fragility as mortals, and in part because we are in a moment of awakened social reckoning and social justice, and poetry has always been an instrument for that as well. And I think we'll end up talking a little bit about that today.
So as sort of a tool for analyzing human experience, do you think poetry varies from other uses of language? Is there something specific about poetry that serves a certain need different from prose or nonfiction or jokes or songs or, all the myriad uses of language, right?
Jokes and songs, and how we draw the lines between these genres is often quite hard. I love poetries with jokes in them. Some of the poems I think we're going to share today have some jokes in them. And I love poems that feel a little bit like prose. But I think it's the refinement of the language and and in some way the way poetry is language being language. It's like I can use the resources of this unique human tool in order to address this problem, this concern, this feeling of exaltation. And for me, what is so extraordinary about poetry is how the greatest poets develop the simple term for it would be style, but it's not just style, it's a vision, it's a way of looking at the world, it's a particular recognizable lens that's stamped with that poet's personality and ways of managing. And so poems allow us to feel the reality of another person very, very directly. And for me, as someone who reads a lot of poems, that has become the thing I can't resist. Like, what is it that makes this poet's language completely different from everybody else's? And what's what's that unique sort of fingerprint or DNA? What is that unique thing that this poet has? And I just I just can't get enough of that. And I think people, when they start, people tend to be on one side or another of the poetry threshold. They're backing away, politely nodding, since they feel poetry, should be paid deference. Yeah, I'll read, catch you later. Or they have found language will do this for them. And I think of one of the first people I filmed with, Katie Couric, for my television series a long time ago. Katie picked the poem we read. She picked Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, which was in fact one of the poems that I put in with my colleague in that JAMA article. And she said that poem, that she lives with that poem. It helped her through her loss of her husband. It helped her through her loss of her mother. And that's something else we do. We keep the language of a poem near us and we return to it. As I'm not going to use the cliche, as a friend, as some sort of personal
touchstone of some kind. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the poetry is having a moment, and I think one of the reasons for that is the prominence of Amanda Gorman at the
Sure.
inauguration in the Super Bowl. And spoken word poetry is a little bit different from poetry that is meant to be read and written down. Do you think, how do you see that difference? And do you think they play different roles?
Well, poetry has always been very often a performed art. I mean, if you think about Shakespeare plays, there's often a lyre. We use that term lyric poetry. That refers to a lyre, a musical performance, a public, and when we talk about a poem's author, we call that person a speaker, right? As if that person is speaking out loud to another person. It was really only in the early years of the 20th century, with the advent of modernism, that we began to think of poems as like having to live all by themselves on these cold pages.
Mm.
And of our encounter with them having to be a difficult decoding. People of the late 19th century and early 20th century were asked to memorize poems in school and to recite them in pageants. And I've sat down with, older people. John McCain, Senator John McCain was one of them, and who'd been raised in a place where he had to memorize poems, and he could just, so back to Amanda Gorman, she's so fresh, she's so new, her performance was so electrifying. But in terms of that poetry is a public art, and an art that serves occasions, she's reigniting and invigorating something old. Obviously, one also wants to say of spoken word that it's emerged as it's emerged to meet the needs of our political moment. It's emerged as an art form that carries voice in the sense of agency, voice in the sense of I have an identity and I count. And it's a way of being counted and of counting oneself. And so it's a civic. Spoken word is, often tuned to a kind of protest on a protest setting, but it spoken word says, I live among others and I see where the world might be better, and I can raise my voice. And so it's a profoundly moral kind of poetry. And what is so wonderful is that poetry is being, through spoken word and also of course through hip hop, has been ushered back into the center of our culture, with hip hop doing what I certainly never thought poetry could do, hip hop making rhyme cool again. When I was a kid growing up, the most uncool thing was to rhyme. And we had lost.
Not just rhyme, like virtuoso rhyme, multisyllabic rhyme, crazy mosaic rhyme. Yeah.
Right. No, that rhyme could be so charged and vibrant. We needed hip hop to show us. So Amanda, I am very excited to announce that Amanda will be in the opening episode of season 4 of Poetry in America.
Oh, great.
Started to film. She will be in our Phyllis Wheatley episode, and I'm pretty psyched.
Yeah. I interviewed a gentleman named Halim Flowers, who's a writer and activist here in town. And he, when he was in prison, he stopped calling himself a hip hop artist and started calling himself a poet. And I said, that's the same thing, right? And he's like, yeah, but I wanted to impress a girl, so she'd keep visiting me in prison. So I called myself a poet.
Okay. Some of that
he's very accomplished, but yeah. But so for the purposes of tonight, instead of poems that are all directly about illness and healing and life and death in a very direct way, we're sort of taking on this conceit that I have also stolen from another program we did. So last fall, I interviewed the book editors from the Washington Post, and they had their annual Best of 2020 list. And in compiling that list, they had polled the audience of Washington Post readers about how the pandemic was changing their reading habits. And they identified sort of 4 kinds of readers. And I have challenged you to choose a poem for each of those 4 kinds of readers. This is starting to feel a little bit like Seder, but the So the 4 kinds of readers for which we are going to discuss 4 different poems this evening are people who are just really leaning into the pandemic, reading as much as they can about epidemiology and plague and medical care and public health, and just really informing themselves and using this kind of reading to really kind of lean in to the subject matter. So tell us about the poem that you have chosen to represent that kind of reader.
Those readers, many of them would be reading about other epidemics through history. And one of those epidemics they'll have been reading about, cued by so many physicians who lived through this time. One of those epidemics is the AIDS epidemic that came suddenly, decimated a population, had fell disproportionately on certain people, seemed to be differentially treated. And so I've chosen Mark Doty's This Your Home Now, a poem on which I created a television episode. And here's why Mark Doty's This Your Home Now is such a satisfying poem. It's way too long to read to you now. But what it is a meditation on how we comfort ourselves and whether we deserve to comfort ourselves, and how we process trauma. And this is something we're all, those who are leaning into the epidemic are thinking also, what will our culture be like afterwards? How will I feel? How will I remember this moment? And so I'd like to show you a little clip from this television episode. Mark Doty's poem begins in a very everyday way, with its speaker frustrated because he can't find a good place to get a haircut. His barber shop has closed and he's feeling upset. He says nothing is right. And as we're reading this poem, we're thinking, like, get a life. You know, why are you taking not finding a barber shop so hard? And so let's play the little clip where he finds a barber shop.
Dull early winter, back on 18th, up spiraling red in a cylinder of glass, and just below the line of sidewalk, a new sign, Willie's Barbershop. Dark hallway, glass door, and there's presumably Willie. When I tell him I used to go down the street, he says in an inscrutable accent, "This your home now." Puts me in a chair, asks me what I want, and soon he's flipping and singing with the radio's Latin dance tune. I think that phrase was probably the first trigger for this poem. Here's somebody I've never seen before, looks at me so exuberant, says, "This your home now?" Okay, you want to return such an embrace, and also it starts to raise this question of home, right? Is home what I've just lost? Is the barbershop one of my homes? Could this be another place of comfort and familiarity? I don't know. I think that home perhaps also suggests where the poem is going in terms of relaxing into another level of contemplation.
So one thing I love so much about this Mark Doty poem that it's in the chat and you can read it, you can look at it now or later at your leisure, is the way it takes its time with its speaker who doesn't quite know what he's thinking himself, who's wandering the city, knowing he's uncomfortable, looking somehow for someone to take care of him, to touch him. And these are, of course, longings that we are having as well. Many of us all of us probably remember last summer when none of us could get our hair cut or colored at all. And the first moment that could happen was a cause for celebration. This poem goes to how those casual needs. Sometimes, those casual needs to have somebody touch the outside of your head may lead into a deeper place. And in this poem, I'll just give away its central conceit. The speaker of the poem descends in the barber chair, in his imagination, as he's relaxing into his haircut. He descends into, as you'll see, his past.
Our guardian Willie defies time, his chair our ferry boat, and we go down in the trance of touch and the skull buzz drone singing cranial nerves in the direction of peace. And so I understand that in the back of this nothing building on 18th Street, I found that door ajar before in daylight when it shouldn't be, some forgotten bulb left burning in a fathomless shaft of my uncharted nights. The men I have outlived await their turns, the fevered and wasted, whose mothers and lovers scattered their ashes and gave away their clothes. 20 years, and their names tumble into a numb well, though in truth, I have not forgotten one of you. May I never forget one of you. These layers of men arrayed in their no longer breathing ranks.
Obviously written alluding to the horrible era of the AIDS epidemic, because the men that he's remembering were buried by their mothers. And
Yes.
That is a reminder, these were young men.
The poem is written in tercet, so that 3-line stanzas, and in a way, that's a little bit of a nod to the great poem in tercets in the Western world, which is, of course, the Divine Comedy, in which Dante is descending into hell.
I love that we don't notice, how many of us notice, including me, how many of us notice that a poem written in 3-line stanzas harkens back to Dante's Divine Comedy? But when you do notice, you realize how far back goes this effort to reckon with the sorrows of our past. Dante's poem begins in middle age, with a speaker in middle age who's kind of caught in between, unsure about himself, guilty, not sure where he ultimately belongs, heaven, hell, or somewhere in between. And that's the predicament of this speaker who has survived AIDS. And the good news is that this speaker gets a good haircut, accepts the minor comfort, the non-erotic touch, accepts being a live man, and having the privilege of remembering, the privilege of being a poet. So that's one I love for those of you leaning into the epidemic.
You talked a little bit about how spoken word and the performative aspect of that kind of poetry has its own power. I wouldn't have noticed that this was written in tercets if I had just heard it performed, right? That formality of the triple lines its
Exactly.
own power, right?
Yeah, we don't want to do without the printed page when we need it. And a poet who blocks off those stanzas in that way is inviting those who might notice to see him paying his poet paying homage to Dante, thanking his precursors. I find this poem with its wandering, this poem takes its time, and that's a that when we process difficult things, we have to sort of mentally perambulate, and wind our way through this topic. You'll notice that I'm making a kind of spiral. I'm spiraling down the lines of a cross and then down from the right-hand margin of a page to the left. And there's some, if you elongate that movement, you sort of get the spiral down into the underworld of this barber chair. So Doty writes this poem in the most unpretentious, unpoety way. It almost reads like prose until, and it's one of those poems that with rereading, its wisdom kind of grows on you, and the vulnerability of its speaker, and whose vulnerability probably reminds you of your own, grows on you. So this is a poem of introspection that enables the introspection of the kind of reader who wants to lean right in to the disease and the self.
I mean, it does read a little like prose, but then there are those clever rhythmic tumble in a numb well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Right. No, beautiful. And Mark Doty can be so lapidary, so polished and glittering a poet, that he doesn't have to prove that here. That's I love. And for those who know the rest of Doty's work, they would say that a part of this poem that that is, you can watch in the rest of the episode, there's a wonderful part of the poem where the speaker is settling into his haircut and he's looking at all the pictures on the barbershop walls of boxers and starlets and anonymous guys, smoking cigars, and the delicacy of Doty's poetic instrument there, and his capacity to sort of paint pictures is all on display. But then he moves back into this different, very, very humane and humble register, which I love.
Mm-hmm. So the second kind of reader could be seen as the opposite of the first kind. So the escapist reader. In the case of prose, the Washington Post editors identified this as a lot of fantasy, a lot of romance, a lot of sci-fi. People just wanting to imagine they are in a different world than this one. What poem did you pick for that kind of reader?
So I picked Marianne Moore's The Fish, which takes us under the sea. And who doesn't like to look at marine life?
Right.
This is, this poem, which was written during the First World War, it's looking forward to the amazing science shows that we're all used to. This is really before there were periscopes that could even see underneath the ocean. But I have always loved this much anthologized poem for how it twinkles, for its sheer visual beauty. And I would link this poem, we're going to show you a clip in a second, as well, to the way so many of us during this pandemic have absorbed ourselves in new hobbies,
right?
Especially crafts like pickling, embroidery, woodworking, photography. And so what is the satisfaction of that? of giving form, right? Of providing disciplined molding of the physical world. And the pleasure often in reading Marion Moore is the pleasure both in admiring the beautifully formed things of this world. We're about to see some very beautifully formed fish. Like, how did they get that way? How, how did they? Well, they got that way through evolution.
Yeah, but they don't need to be that beautiful. They just are,
They don't need to be that beautiful. They just are. And so in what ways do we as human beings ever achieve the kind of artless beauty that animals do? Well, she says we get there through hard trying, through application and through a kind of ethical respect for, processes of formation. So I think I am talking in this little clip with some scientists from Conservation International and with poet Jory Graham and with ex-Vice President Al Gore. And we are under the ocean.
The water drives a wedge of iron through the iron edge of the cliff, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, ink bespattered jellyfish, crabs like green lilies, and submarine toadstools slide each on the other.
How we went from that iron wedge, describing the ocean water as iron, and then to the soft-bodied, like the pink rice grains, and it just got soft in that part. And I actually found my voice lighten when I read that soft-bodied part.
This is the place where all of a sudden the poem rhetorically breaks, and it goes, whereupon.
And it's so beautiful when it breaks.
And it breaks, whereupon the stars.
When I read it, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, and I was taking the stars, and I was thinking about first that this is nighttime, and I thought actually we're talking about a tide pool and it's starfish.
At first reading, I immediately thought of the stars in the sky.
Even funny, I read the stars first as a star, and then I was like, oh no, there's stars.
If you've ever looked at a starfish and you see it, it looks like pink rice grains. It's as if it has glue on it and you sprinkled pink rice grains on it.
The pink rice grains, maybe that is like a sea snail's eggs or bits of sponge.
This is suddenly this joy-like break.
But you can see pink and ink.
Yes.
That's my favorite rhyme in the poem.
That is such a lovely escape.
It's such a lovely escape. And I realized that I have lived for years I've taken little teeny pleasure snacks just on that pink and ink rhyme. And think about the exquisite craft of a poet who can give you the visual splendor of fish that wade. The poem begins, the fish wade through black jade. And you say, oh my gosh, ocean water really does look like black jade, or the little nodules on a starfish really do look like pink rice grains, and can do that exact same thing to your ear, right? So that the rhymes, she's doing a pairing of the rhymes that is like and working in concert with a pairing of the metaphors. And by the way, she's also set herself the incredibly strict set of requirements that every stanza of this poem will be exactly the same number of syllables.
Oh, really?
And that each stanza will have 1 syllable in the first line, 3 in the second line, 9 in the third line, 6 in the fourth line, and 8 in the fifth line. And so that craft is making the whole thing that much harder. And through it all, she's asking questions about how the development of poetic imagery, that is that mental process that a writer is doing, how that speaks to or lives in the environment of a reader's mind, and the ways in which a writer and a reader, who are kind of need to be environmentally harmonious, right? They sort of speak to each other, how they are like stone and rock, stone and water, and soft-bodied creatures and light. And so there is a kind of vast set of ecologies. And if that isn't a sort of trippy utopian escape, of course, I'm calling this poem fantasy. It's written against the pressure of her own, Marianne Moore's own dread at World War I that was grinding on as she wrote the poem. And her brother was an army chaplain on a naval destroyer in European waters. And so there's menace. There's menace in this ocean as well. And yeah, very often our escapes are driven not by escapism, but by something, we use that word so pejoratively, but by something much, much deeper.
Right. A little edge of danger.
A little edge of danger.
Why do you think it's anthologized so often? Do you think it is because of those confining structural rules she put on herself?
I think it's easy. She's not the easiest poet in the world, and this is actually not the easiest poem. That's a really great question. It's beautiful. I mean, I'm not sorry it was anthologized. I remember reading it as a very young beginning reader of poetry and not really understanding it at all, but just loving, wow, water does look like jade. It was sort of like a primer in metaphor making. Like, wow, look at what you can do with language. Look, Marianne Moore loved the glass flowers at Harvard. Some of your viewers have probably visited and seen the glass flowers, and we admire accomplishments of craft and verbal, visual, sculptural, oral, and she's a poet you can see trying really hard to merit that admiration. In the same, this may be the first comparison of hip hop and Marianne Moore ever ventured, but her precision and exactitude and her kind of daring, watch me do this, has some of the quality of the best hip hop, where the rhymes are over the top brilliant, as if we are enlarged as human beings by stretching to write a rhyme so wonderful.
So our third kind of reader is, I'm sure a lot of people will identify with. This is how I found myself reading in the pandemic, which is seeking comfort, rereading old favorites, going back to classics, sort of rediscovering work that had brought joy and comfort in another time. And so for the comfort seekers, what is their poem?
I'm gonna have to deviate from this one a little bit and say that we've been seeking comfort, and we've also been seeking wisdom about the way and deeper understanding of where we've gone wrong. And the poem that I've brought is Langston Hughes's What Happens, the poem. This is one I don't need to read. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So this poem speaks to our awareness, a kind of global awareness of all that we have not yet done as well as we could. And what happens when, so I think this is not comforting, except it is in a sort of bracing when we face into the truth of what we have not achieved in arriving at the just society that we thought we should have by now, that we were so unprepared for this pandemic that that there is a kind of social contract to which we all as citizens are sort of half-hearted signers. And this is not comforting. Although again,
it's familiar.
Well,
it just has its own source of comfort.
And reckoning, I think that we understand that we are in a moment of social honesty. We are trying to be in a moment of social honesty and of not pushing things under the rug. And I'll say a last thing about this particular poem. This is a classic. It's a classic poem, and when the Black Lives Matter movement began to be heard, you were hearing this poem, and as the COVID pandemic swept the country, you were hearing this poem as well. A classic is a description of something that's timeless, and I think this poem is that, but it's also a work that tells us that certain problems should not be classic. They shouldn't be true forever. This we're about to hear part of this poem. It was written in the 1950s. It shouldn't be as true today as it was then.
All right, here is Langston Hughes, Harlem.
Langston Hughes was heavily influenced by music. So there's a rhythm, there's a musical rhythm to this poetry. It's a lot like jazz. It's clearly one melody, yes, but there's some ad-libbing, some improvisation as you go along. Some of the lines rhyme. It's a different rhyming scheme, but it's enough to remind you that it's a poem, just like it'd be enough to remind you that it was a jazz song.
This whole piece, that when you do it, you hear the jazz and blues, so you have to then take your mouth and make your tongue begin and respond. What happens to a dream deferred? Do that, 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 do. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a so, and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? He gives you.
Well, you just sang this all as bebop,
right? Yeah,
right? With some scat.
Yeah.
I hear, and maybe it just sags like a heavy load, an older country blues.
So I left out, as I was introducing that of course, art, and in particular, the arts of the blues and of jazz, have an extraordinary way of transforming pain into a kind of exaltation. And Langston Hughes, in the artfully composed lines of this poem, a poem that, by the way, not only was written to be spoken, but that Hughes himself would recite with a jazz quintet around him. And yet when you look at it on the page, you get a set of mysterious instructions for how to read it, for thinking perhaps that you're not alone, for hearing, sometimes it just sags like a heavy load. The way those words sit on the page dictate a little bit how to read it, and begin to take us from the New York of Harlem to the country places that that Black Americans came from, and begin to sort of sketch out a whole transhistorical map of where we've been and where we're going. Remarkable poem.
You said that it shouldn't still be true in terms of the bias and segregation and racism inherent in it. But of course, there's something about the rhythm and the instructions, as you say, that will always be true. There's something about what it's telling us to feel.
And the resources of the community, right? The extraordinary resources of the community that has turned utter disappointment. I mean, Langston Hughes was so disappointed in Harlem. He came to Harlem in the 1920s. He expected that a lot of the problems, the smaller problems he saw in the 1920s would be solved. And what he saw instead was a deepening and a darkening and a closing in. And yet he remains a cherished poet, because he understands that in sharing our suffering, there is joy. And in singing it again and again, singing the classic repetition of a line of the blues, there is a satisfaction and even a synthesis. And he and the tradition to which he belongs know that better, and continue to educate Americans on how on the resources of art and the resources of song.
So our fourth and final poem is for the kind of reader who has just lost all attention span for reading in this pandemic, which again, no jury would convict you, but so we identified, or the Washington Post editors identified, this kind of reader who's sort of the anti-reader, who may have been more of a diligent reader in the before times, but just is so thrown off their game by our unprecedented circumstances that they don't really have the attention span to read in the way they used to. So what is your fourth poem?
Short poem. It's a super short poem, and it's a very familiar one. Many listening will know it. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So this reader is sometimes just absorbed, as we all are in the ice cream. We are, spooning into it. This poem is about many, many things, but one of them is about savoring the little things, and savoring them, although maybe also squabbling about them, with someone we love. This is a poem set in that domestic, closed space that we've all been living in, where the atmosphere of our relationships has thickened, both thickened with more annoyance and more friction and also more gratitude and more generosity. And so I picked this poem because it's people have thought of it as like, why is that a poem? It's just like it's a refrigerator note about a nothing, about a minor event between people, and yet in its language, so much is, I was going to say distilled, but it's like a plum. It's like a big, juicy plum of a poem. And I asked, just one more word of introduction. When we filmed on this poem, I asked mostly couples to come. 3 poets, and John Hodgman, who's an expert advice columnist and sort of famous comedian, but then a bunch of couples to talk about plums. Here they are.
I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. The useful thing that I picked up on in that reading is the way that you have a good sense of my saving. The awareness might result in annoyance on your part at times. Yeah.
There could be a sense of trying to exculpate oneself by saying, I don't know, probably you were saving them, but there's no way for me to know, so I just went ahead and ate them.
Could he be saying, in which you were probably saving?
Like you were probably saving these for breakfast, like that?
Yeah. Is there the possibility of a kind of irritation at the domestic regularity?
From that reading, that he's a little bit annoyed at her, and you're probably saving these for breakfast, but now I've eaten them.
If you did something wrong, if you took somebody's stuff, you don't stick in the dagger to let them know just exactly how much they missed out on. You really try to downplay what it was. Like, oh yeah, I went to that restaurant you wanted to go to. Wasn't that good? Don't worry, you didn't miss anything. That's what you do if you love somebody.
Forgive me. They were delicious. So sweet and so cold.
Jerk.
It's like he's mocking that I didn't get to enjoy the sweetness of the plums.
Now, behind marital disputes about eating fruit, actually, when you think about it, the entire Judeo-Christian tradition and all our woes begin from a moment in which a marital couple have a dispute about eating fruit. So this has a big, big echo behind it, but the echo is much reduced. This is really just to say it's a little moment in a marital understanding.
I'm not sure I would have gone to the Garden of Eden with that poem if that reader hadn't found it.
I think the poem comes out of the Garden of Eden, right? We struggle with those we love. I find the poem's mix of aggression, of aggression, of passive aggression, of erotic play, of and its recognition, by the way, of the Depression. This was also a poem written in a time of national crisis. William Carlos Williams was a physician. He couldn't afford to make a living, couldn't make a living as a poet. And he was lucky to survive reasonably well through the Depression because people kept having babies and strep throat, and they would pay him what they could. But it was a time of privation, and it may be that those plums really, those 3 plums really matter. I don't know if they are 3, actually. I've always thought of them as 3, that they really mattered. And so I gave that poem because it's a poem that, you know, almost doesn't want to be a poem, and yet is such a fantastic It's such a fantastic poem. The more you read it, and if you, watch the episode, if you read the poem yourself and if you watch the episode, you'll be astounded at how many nuances of relationship this problem of the plums in the icebox will reveal to us.
So we are almost out of time, but I want to ask one audience question. It's a big question, but I know it's one that you've thought a lot about. Do you have tips for educators about helping students find a way into poetry, thinking about those students who come in convinced that it isn't for them?
Well, I have many tips for educators, and I do offer them in a series of online courses for educators, as well as courses I offer for high school students. I think the tips I have I'll say this. There's a wonderful poem by Billy Collins where he depicts the ordinary situation of poetry as one where we're trying to torture the meaning of the poem out of it. And he actually literally has the poem tied to a chair where we torture it. So you're not obliged to be a torturer to read a poem. He says he'd rather just like wave to it on water skis. Or look curiously after it, the way he looks after the mouse under the table. And so I think the advice that I have a whole lot of advice, but the thing that makes it easy is to have an attitude of kind of quizzical curiosity, not to oblige yourself to torture all the meanings out of it, and to see how it acts on you.
Well, Lisa New, it has been a real pleasure spending an hour with you. Thank you for choosing poems for us to think through in these pandemic times. And we can't wait to welcome you to Planet Word.
I can't wait to visit. I'm so excited. And I believe some of the poems we just read are in the Planet Word Gallery.
Yes, Harlem is. This is Just to Say is. Yep.
3 of them, 3 of 4. You can go and see for yourself at Planet Word.
In our secret poetry nook, which you reach through a hidden door in a bookcase.
Yeah,
come visit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. See you next time.